In this module, we're gonna really shift gears, right? So we've spent, the last, however long, a majority of the class really kind of talking about, what climate change is, how climate change works, right? Kind of nuts and bolts. Climate change, on different time scales, where we talked about, big picture, kind of tectonic style climate change, as well as anthropogenic climate change. And what we know, right, if we kind of go back and distill all of that, is that fundamentally, in the short term and in a very real way, the Earth is warming. We can look at a graph that shows variation from average, so what we call temperature anomaly per year, and it's pretty obvious that we're on a fairly warm trend, right? It's much warmer than it used to be. So, when old timers are talking about walking to school in the snow and the kids don't have to do that, yeah, a little bit of that's true. So the other thing that we know is that as humans, we use energy. We spend a lot of time talking about energy, and historically, we've used sources of energy that are essentially what we call the slow carbon, right? So coal, oil, natural gas, and we still use those. That's carbon that was essentially sequestered, and we've then kind of pulled that out, used the combustion to create power. And because of that, we know that there's an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, also coupled with land use changes. So, right, that impedes, kind of the biosphere's ability to pull out CO2. And so, obviously you look at something like the famous, Keeling curve put together by, started by Dave Keeling and Scripps institution. And we can see that CO2 levels have risen considerably, particularly, since they started measuring, right, in the 1950s. We've gone from about 315 parts per million to, in the low 400s, 410, 420. Those are indisputable. The other things that are indisputable are, how CO2 reacts with long-wave radiation. That's just physics and chemistry. And so we've really hopefully nailed down all of the realities. And another thing that's interesting to look is, so we also talked about climate modeling, and we can say, all right, now how is this going to look in the future? Right? How, if we don't change anything, if we change this thing, if we change that thing. And so we have these different projections of future temperatures, right? And one of the things that you oftentimes hear, really kind of came out of the Paris Agreement, was the notion of sort of limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. It's about 6 degrees. And that's, again, the average, right? It's not 2 degrees on a given day. It's 2 degrees as an annual average, which is actually quite a bit. So we want to try to limit that warming that we're going to see, in the near future, in the next 50 years, in the next 100 years, and, obviously far beyond that. So how do we do that, right? That brings in the notion of climate change policy. So what are some policies that we can do to deal with climate change? Or what are some policies that we can enact? Or what are some behaviors that we can do? And it really falls into a couple of categories. And we're going to go through kind of 4 specific categories. It might actually take us a while to get through all of them, but I think it's important. And then kind of on the tail end, we'll actually talk about kind of economic policy, right? How we do this at the political level. The first policy that we're going to talk about, our first category of policies that we're going to talk about, is adaptation, because climate change is here. Again, you kind of go back and you can just look at the data and just measure the temperature outside. Climate change is here, and to some degree, we have to deal with it. So adaptation includes all sorts of things, right? We're going to go through those pretty specifically, but this is really how can we adapt to climate change that's unavoidable? Again, thinking about this 2 degrees Celsius goal, right? So even if we meet that goal, there's some adaptation that we're going to have to live with, right? Sea temperature, storm surges, flooding, heat island effects, all sorts of things that we can deal with in the adaptation. Mitigation, this is a big one, right? And again, we're going to come back and kind of further explore these concepts. Mitigation is how can we avoid a warming climate, or how can we avoid climate change going forward, right? So what sorts of things can we do to avoid further change to the climate? This is really where we kind of get into energy sources and many other things. This is also generally where we're going to have that discussion about politics, right, and economic policy, because that's almost kind of entirely designed to exist here within the mitigation, right? Like, so what are some things we can do? What are some policies we can make? What are some behaviors we can change that will modify what we see going forward, right? How can we change the future in a sense? And again, going back to those, long-term temperature predictions, you can see the no change, right? The no change is always kind of the most extreme event. And then, different levels of mitigation are essentially the different kind of future potentials laid out, by groups of climate scientists. Then we enter kind of a weird world, right? So we adapt to climate change, we mitigate it as much as possible, and then we can actually kind of go in the negative sense. So one really interesting thing to talk about is solar radiation management, and that is decreasing the amount of energy received by the Earth. Think about it like putting a giant shade umbrella up. It's an interesting concept because it doesn't really solve the problem, but it helps with the effects, right? It lessens the effects. And so that's kind of its own realm of policy, again, kind of going above and beyond, right? Kind of going in a negative sense rather than adapting and changing our behavior. Like, how can we lessen the problem itself? And then everyone's favorite, carbon removal. This is like directly fixing the problem, like triage in its ultimate sense. So we've now, it's well known and well understood that CO2 is the primary driver of climate change. This is saying, okay, great, let's just go get the CO2. And it turns out there's a couple of potential ways to do that. Like I said, we'll go through and talk about that in particular. But for the rest of our time in this video, I actually want to talk about adaptation. So here we're going to talk about climate adaptation, and this is just absolutely unavoidable. Like I said, we observe a changing climate, right? That's something that you can just go and look at. You can look at the data, and it's clear as day. So we're going to have to adapt, and in many cases, we've already started to adapt. But this, again, as we'll see, has lots of kind of different components to it. And in some cases, it can get fairly political. And again, what we're going to see, particularly just in this realm of climate policy, cash rules everything around us, right? It's actually all about money. And so most methods of adaptation, right, changing the way that we do something to adapt to a warmer climate, costs money, right? So there's no getting away from that. But one of the big things to think about is, well, whose money, right? Is it going to cost me money? Am I going to pay to, modify my living space, my world, my property, so that it kind of works better in a different climate? Or am I going to get the government involved, right? And that's, partially my money, it's partially your money as well. And so again, we start to see here enters like political philosophy, right? Like, is climate adaptation up to the individual or is it up to the government? Well, obviously, the easiest answer is some combination thereof. But hopefully we'll see going forward that there really is kind of some things where we need a big system and big money to solve these problems. So one example could be, let's say that you live in a place that is experiencing more flooding because we have increased precipitation due to a changing climate. Right? That's kind of a standard thing that we see. We see increased flooding, be it from storm events caused by a warmer sea surface, or melting events, or rain on snow events. There's lots of things that kind of geologically can cause flooding, many of them exacerbated by a warmer climate. So the idea is, if I have a house and it's in an area that floods often, I can do two things, basically. I can do three things. I can move. I can just get out of there. I could pay the money to have my house put up on stilts or something like that. Another common thing is actually to have really tall foundations, and we'll actually touch on that again. So foundations that are a couple of feet above grade, so everything below that is concrete. So if it floods, I'm going to be okay. I'll put a pump down there. So that's great, and that's going to cost me money. Would it be better for my village or my collection of houses to all get together and decide that we want to build a seawall, or we will want to build a floodway, or we want to slow water down so it infiltrates? Well, nobody's going to be able to pay for that, right? So when we have projects that are large that solve the problem for many, many, many people, there's really no other way to do it than the government, or making a pseudo government, right? Like an HOA or something like that, paying kind of everyone's pooling together to solve this problem. So beyond, and in thinking about an individual, one of the things that we also see is that this can kind of cross over into the financial standing of groups of people and areas, right? Regions. And so actually this is something that we see, that we saw with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, right? So, the areas that tended to be more economically depressed tended to be the areas that flooded, right? Because those houses are cheaper for one reason, because they're probably going to flood. The flood infrastructure wasn't necessarily in place for those, and so people that lived in a more expensive part of town didn't have to deal with those problems. And so we start to see, again, kind of finance and economic standing kind of creeping into this discussion. And one of the things that we can always talk about is like equality versus equity, right? So equity is really providing those services to the groups of people who need it most. So kind of finding those areas where the houses are, susceptible to flooding, and solving that problem rather than solving the problem for everyone, which would be equality. Right? So the last thing that I want to talk about before we're going to go through some specific kind of methods of adaptation. But before we get to doing that, I wanted to talk about kind of the same problem we were just talking about, but in this case, it's going to be at the political and kind of national level. So we are what's considered a rich country, right? And there's quite a few of us in the world. Generally Europe, parts of South America, North America for sure, and we have lots of resources. And so if we decide, yes, let's go save Miami, we can save Miami. We've got the money to save Miami. But actually, that's not true for every country, right? And one of the biggest things that's an issue is, as sea level continues to rise, I think 80% of the world's population lives in a place that's fairly close to water. And as that water begins to rise and storm surges begin to be more aggressive, we get problems, right? And so one of the things that we see in Miami all the time is they talk about sunny day flooding, right? So Miami is kind of a poster child for this in our country, where they get, as the tides are fluctuating, the tides are actually fluctuating high enough where those floods will actually move into town, not even associated with a storm. And then a storm, that's a whole different game, right? But if we were to lose Miami, hypothetically, or if Miami were to undergo a serious flood and be dealing with those issues, we would see some level of kind of economic shockwave through our nation. But Miami isn't like the heart of our financial system. If we then take that idea and extrapolate it to nations, so let's say that there's flooding in India or China related to climate change, which we all are kind of part of. We saw what happened with global supply chain issues with COVID, right? Actually, when the guy crashed the boat in the Suez Canal, not too long ago, we all remember those pictures. Well, that blocked international commerce, and so if we have significant flooding in India, places that couldn't afford to build a seawall, China, that can actually send economic shockwaves through the entire world. So it's really important to kind of think about some of these problems really are transcendent, right? Like we can focus on them being a problem of a nation, like, oh, you're going to get some flooding, you better watch out for that. But when that flooding occurs, everyone can kind of feel the pain, right? So we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to talk about specific types of adaptation, how we are and how we plan to adapt to a changing climate. And then beyond that, again, we'll talk about mitigation. We're going to have a second discussion later about mitigation, like political policy. Yeah, and then we'll talk about some ways of changing the boundary conditions, which is what we kind of think about as geoengineering. All right, I'll catch you in the next video.